so great to have everyone here today of our colloquium leaders and seminar leaders. And this extraordinary variety of materials may well leave you with the question that I thought I'd make my topic today, which is, what isn't world literature? So much seems to be covered exactly here already. So I thought I'd take up this issue, particularly where we're in the 11th year. We've had quite a bit of experience of this, vast diversity, as well as now quite a bit of experience of the diversity of approaches to this seemingly infinitely expansive field. So I think, what world literature isn't, for one thing, it's not still the work done 20 years ago by our friends Franco Moretti and the late lamented Pascal Casanova, with their very different mappings. And I think their covers are very nice for the almost, emblematically different way to map the networks that Moretti is talking about, which he's already started to talk about in his conjectures on world literature. And Pascal Casanova's République mondiale des lettres, which these are both, again, 20 or more years ago. These are very seminal, important works, which we continue to teach and think about. They're important starting points. And yet, clearly the field is moving beyond, as indeed they themselves move beyond this work. A little polemic I have with discussions of people like Moretti and Casanova is that so often people look at their first thing they ever said and then don't look at anything they said afterwards, something we can do better. I particularly like, though, the map of Casanova on the paperback edition that you see here, because this is an illustration from the Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll, in which the leader, the bellman who leads this expedition in search of a mythical animal somewhere in the South Seas, has this absolutely blank map with nothing on it. And the crew members are very happy about this map. They say, what's the use of Mercator's North Poles and equators, tropics, zones, and meridian lines? So the bellman would cry. And the crew would reply, they're merely conventional signs. Other maps are such shapes, with their islands and capes, but we've got our brave captain to thank. So the crew would protest, that he's brought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. So in one sense, world literature is everything or nothing, possibly less like cosmopolitanism, news from nowhere or everywhere, as in our dueling cosmopolitanisms. And you see here you have the meridian, the scale of maps, miles at the bottom is simply dots and lines. It itself is completely different. So in some sense, the study of world literature can't still be where it was, must not be where it was 20 years ago. And if nothing else, and I feel this most keenly, it is certainly not what is world literature. Again, that was written 20 years ago by some sort of archaic pre-modern Damrosch itself. And we try to think beyond this. And of course, it wasn't rightly critiqued since then from a variety of directions. There was a strategic value 20 years ago in emphasizing translatability, for example, opening up the canon to the full world beyond the sort of major Western European powers that so often had totally dominated. This also meant emphasizing translatability. It meant bringing in translation theory. And as Mary Venuti is well aware, at the time that people like he and I were in college and graduate school, and this was the pre-modern era, there were not courses in translation studies, translation theory in any comparative literature department known to me. You were not supposed to use translations. If you did, you're not supposed to admit it. And this was very much trying to think, well, we actually need translations. We do use translations all the time. And how do we do that? However, that perspective from 20 years ago is certainly showing its age, and it has been open to a variety of critiques over the years. 3 well-known books, all of which I respond to and react to in various ways. Emily Apter particularly critiquing the politics of translatability and arguing for untranslatability and the right to the untranslatable. We have the work group with a very cogent discussion, particularly of Moretti, and the question of what does it really mean to look at the politics of the uneven landscape of world literature. We have recently Peng Chia, the What is a World, arguing that too much world literary studies just tries to describe the world, which he wants to change, and he wants to emphasize those works that themselves are critiquing a world system, which is also true of the work group as well. But these critiques themselves are now not the last word, or even the latest word, coming respectively from 2013, 2015, and 2016, is already 5 years ago, Peng Chia's book. And like them, we continue to refine and develop, however, what are not only the latest questions, but these are eternally contested questions, which is why, as for example, Venuti's seminar goes back to antiquity, as a number of our seminars reach back. Even those of us who may have a primarily modern emphasis gain a lot by looking deeply into the history. This is certainly true of translation studies, as we see, for example, in Steiner's After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation, important work from now, 45 years ago or so, itself talking about the resistance, among other things, to translation, and of course, multiply therefore translated itself. Here we have, both translated visually and typographically. Particularly elegant, I think, is a German translation, which represents it as though it was in the order of Hebrew writing, nach Babel, quite interesting. And we have Romanian, we have Chinese, as well as Spanish. And he talks about his image of the Tower of Babel. He talks about it as an image of resistance to a hegemonic language. He says the outwardly communicative extrovert thrust of language is secondary. The primary drive is inward and domestic. Each tongue hoards the resources of consciousness, the word pictures of the clan. Language builds a wall around the middle kingdom of the group's identity. It is secret toward the outsider and inventive of its own world. There have been so many thousands of human tongues, there still are, because there have been, particularly in the archaic stages of social history, so many distinct groups intent on keeping from one another the inherited singular springs of their identity and engage in creating their own semantic worlds, their alternatives. This is also very much something Gayatri Spivak emphasizes in talking about the irreducible singularity of literary work, something we all appreciate, even as I think many of us, all of us here, probably more or less have a utopian view that language, literary language, is uniquely communicative with all the changes that have to happen. Just to note here, he's talking about previous periods. He's talking about the theory of the Tower of Babel. Actually, the story of Tower of Babel itself is precisely such an example. Here we have the story from Genesis 11. The whole world had one language and common speech, but as the men of the plain of Shinar start to build the tower, the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they begin to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. That is why it's called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. This is often seen as a sort of tragedy of the loss of commonality and community. But I see it in Steiner's terms, though he doesn't himself discuss this, as a kind of resistance to a hegemonic language on the part of an oppressed minority culture. This is the Hebrews in exile in Babylon resisting the Akkadian culture around them, the cuneiform writing system, and pretending not even to know the name Babylon, coming from Bab Ili, gate of God, which is the ziggurat of Marduk, the patron god, where heaven and earth meet. And anyone there, this is not only, I mean, they're in Babylon, they have to know what what this word mean words, and these are even common words. Eli, the gods, is like Elohim. It's the same root. Bab, even today, can mean like gate in Arabic. These are not uncommon, and they pretend that the very name of their oppressive hegemonic metropolitan center is a Hebrew coinage by God, but it's a scribal error from Balal to Babel. It's a diplography. Instead of writing BLL as a scribe should, the divine scribe wrote BBL by mistake. So it's a scholarly in-joke and a kind of, essentially the most elegant way of saying, fuck you, Babylon. Not in quite so many words, but they do say virtually that in so many words. For example, in the Psalm 137, by the waters of Babel, by rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept, that beautiful, haunting psalm of exile. But this is a psalm not only of exile, but it's a song of resistance. And it's a song of hiding your language from your oppressors. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. There in the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captors asked for us songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. It's like slave owners saying to the darkies, oh, do a little song and dance for us, won't you? And I make that analogy because African-American slaves constantly referred back to this history to process their own experience. But it goes on. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? Ik nashir shirdanai admat nechar. And I think this is deliberately chosen. You can have other words to say a distant land, another land. The term foreign, nechar, is cognate with Akkadian nakarum, which means enemy or rebel. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. And the psalm ends, remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear down its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you've done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Little wonder they didn't sing this psalm for their captors. So we have a kind of what Emily, after decades later, with oddly no reference back to Steiner, much less any serious engagement with, say, Venuti or the entire history of translation studies before or after these periods, she talks about the right to untranslatability, and this is certainly that. And I think we could say today that we might, in terms of what isn't world literature, what is or isn't, we learn a lot from work that is meant not to be world literature, resistance literature, literature that's refusing the world, the hegemonic world around it. Anti-world literature is itself a major form of world literature. And indeed, you can make an entire world literature syllabus, which is kind of interesting to do, of works that refuse the world around them, whether polemically, like this, or affirmatively, as with Dante, who writes the Commedia in Italian, not in Latin. If he wanted to write a world epic matching Virgil on a world scale, he would have written in Latin, of course. But as he does in his Latin De Vulgare Eloquentia, he argues the importance of the vernacular. Now he's going to write not world literature, but create Italian literature. But this, of course, then becomes this incredible world text after the fact, as with my opening slide by three Chinese artists discussing the Divine Comedy with Dante, in which the 100 cantos are replaced by 100 figures from world history, literature, culture. So you have Karl Marx there at the center table, along with Li Bai, the drunken poet leaning back from his typewriter. You have Picasso looking at Abraham Lincoln, looking at Mao Zedong. Steven Spielberg is looking at Picasso, looking at them. Behind them is Mozart, behind them is Shakespeare. And here is Dante up on the upper right, looking down at this Commedia, surrounded by the three artists themselves in a meta-fictional moment on the ramparts, looking down at the world around them. So the extreme of untranslatability might be a work such as Suju Kaing by Marisol Tse Mu, who's writing in Quiche Mayan, and she's won the Netzokoyotl Prize for one of her several novels. This one in particular, she refused to translate. She wanted to be only in Mayan, in Quiche. So this is written precisely, and she does translate other works into Spanish, but this one she kept only in Mayan. And I put this passage up because none of us, I'm going to guess here, can read it. This is a kind of anti-world literature, and yet her insistence on not translating becomes a translational gesture, a cultural political gesture, an intervention in Mexican Guatemalan culture today. And then I know about this because it's discussed by a recent PhD from my department, Matilda Figuerowitz, in her dissertation in an article published in the Journal of World Literature, that then talks about this work and what it means that it's untranslated, even if not necessarily untranslatable. And it then becomes, therefore, a subject of study of world literature at the second level of the discussion of it. So even the most untranslatable is in fact a subject worthy of study. And in the case of the Bible, with its resistance to Akkadian culture, Babylonian culture, its refusal to be translated, the Bible, of course, the single most translated work in the history of any text, as far as I know. So the most resistant work can, in fact, become translated at the end. So how do we do better to encompass the broader world? I think, in the interest of time, I'll pass over a quote that I have from Georg Brandes, which we'll have also in my seminar from 1899 on world literature, in which he talks about the uneven playing field of world literature and says that it's outrageous to him that third-rate French writers are more famous than the best Scandinavian writers, and that even third-rate Scandinavian writers circulate better than the best ones, according to Scandinavians. He said, Hans Christian Andersen is well known, whereas Ibsen and Kierkegaard are not. How can this possibly be? Now, this is, 1899. That's the same issues that Moretti is talking about 100 years later, and we're not doing that much better now. But I will give one thing from the recent book. I did this list of citations of the MLA and a bunch of writers that I've been working on in one way or another. And just picked writers I'm interested in. Let's see how many times in the last decade they were cited as subjects, headings, and entries listed in the Modern Language Association International Bibliography. And it turns out, and I listed them as kind of what I call hyper-canonical, then major authors, sort of like upper middle class, lower middle class, major, upper minor, lower major, minor writers, and then what I call ultra minor, which comes from Berger Moberg, Faroese Comparatus, became an issue in the Journal of World Literature. And what it turns out is the hyper-canonical writers are all writing in certain global languages, French, German, English, and then now also Spanish. These are the very same languages that Brandes was saying were the hegemonic languages in 1899, plus Spanish, one writer. And you'll notice the hegemony of global English. Woolf and Joyce have far more even than Kafka, Borges, or Proust. We get Garcia Marquez, but beyond that, we have to go down to pretty far down Lu Xun to get Chinese. And if you took out the 130 articles on Lu Xun in Chinese, even he falls down to a lower major amount of attention. And you find that the less hegemonic European languages are disfavored to about the extent of the major non-European languages. So we have Knut Hamsun, for example, way down as a minor writer. Multatuli, the Dutch writer, extremely important writer, almost at the very bottom. And again, as Brandes would have said, we have sort of lower ranked French writer like Marguerite Duras is up there way ahead of Tagore or Mahfouz or Murakami because she's writing in French. So how do we do a bit better? And what I want to emphasize here is not only that the global South or the non-West is disadvantaged, equally the case with the minor European languages. Consider Karl Ove Knausgaard, someone who certainly made it onto the map of world literature in a big way as an exceptional figure. But look at his take on world literature when he was growing up. In the second volume of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, he talked about being in an MFA program in Bergen, and I guess this is in the 80s. He said, "We're nobodies, two young lit students chatting away in a rickety old house in a small town at the edge of the world, a place where nothing of any significance had ever happened, and presumably never would. But what we read wasn't nothing. It concerned matters of the utmost significance. It was written by the greatest writers and thinkers and writers in Western culture, and that was basically a miracle." So here he's talking about how world literature is coming to him on the edge of Europe in Bergen, where nothing had happened, nothing ever would happen. He said, a beautiful city, by the way, well worth going to. But what I got very interested, who are then the writers he talks about in the volume, in the book? And I made a list of all the people he talks about. I divided them into Scandinavian writers and writers from any place else. And if you look at the list of the writers from the world, and it's primarily Western writers, also US writers, Claude Simon, Robbe, Sarrault, Eliot, Shakespeare, and this is just the order they come up: Wilde, Olson, Asimov, Berger, John Berger, Cortázar, Genet, Dante, Nietzsche, Hölderlin, Adorno, Mann, Joyce, Homer, Tolkien, Bram Stoker, Bret Easton Ellis, interesting, John Irving, Jack Kerouac, an American thing, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Apollinaire, Éluard, Rilke, Trakl, Ben, Celan, Bachmann, Nelly Sachs, and Proust. Again, it's only those hegemonic languages that Brandes had identified, almost entirely right. It's really almost entirely French, German, English, and a little Spanish. Now, the thing about this is that I myself, have read almost all of those writers, something by them. The few that I have never read, I feel guilty that I haven't read. You know their names. I know their names. I want to have read them and read them all, almost all. But the Scandinavian writers, how many have any of us read if you're not Scandinavian? Øystein Lød, Ole Robert Sunde, Knut Hamsun, the Nobel Prize winner, that's the one that I've read. Jan Kjærstad, Sabia Christensen, Jon Fosse, Ragnar Hofland, Rolf Sagen, Kjartan Fløgstad, Tor Ulven, Mørte Borken Andersen, Henrik Wergeland, who's so famous he doesn't even need to tell you his first name, Herman Wildenvey, Ellen Einan, Gunnar Ekerlof, and equally famous to him, Tarjei Vesaas, whose, again, first name he doesn't give you. Most of those names I had never heard of, right? Let alone had read, let alone feeling guilty about not having read. None of that, with the one exception of Knut Hamsun. And it seems to me this is a challenge for all of us, that we are really needing to remake the map, including of European literature, and to do better. Now, how do we do that? I will say that I have now read Tarjei Vesaas for two reasons. One is because Knausgaard recommends him so strongly, and because Archipelago Books has recently published a very cool translation of one of his books. So I just saw it coming out 2019, and I got it and read it from Archipelago. And again, Archipelago, a very important press. And one of the things that we have to do is support these presses, buy their books, send in contributions. Words Without Borders, Archipelago Books, wherever equivalent you have in whatever your country is, these readers need to be read. And this also suits a lot of our concern. This means both, it needs not only a great writer, but it needs also what Bill Marlin calls gatekeepers, which can be another writer like Knausgaard. It can be a publisher, an editor, a translator who says, you must translate this book and sell it to a publisher. It's a complex interaction that we'll be talking about in various ways. So to sort of move towards actually a conclusion for my sort of utopian hope for what we're doing at the Institute, what we're doing as scholars, teachers, readers, writers of world literature, is that we need to be activists. We need to change the world of world literature. We need to get things translated. We need ourselves to do translations, to promote translations, to support translation, and to use them in interaction with languages. I want my utopian hope when I teach a world literature class is that every student unpredictably will feel they can't live a day longer without studying some language they never knew they needed to know. And this is the case for me, for example, with Nahuatl, which I fell in love with the poetry as a result of reading a translation of a translation, English translation of the Spanish translation by Leon Portilla in his book, Aztec Thought and Culture. So you never know what's going to take you to another language. And also a language you need. It doesn't have to be the language on this side of the world. Norwegian is as important to study, to bring into mainstream discourse as Thai or Nahuatl, as far as I'm concerned. And I think we also need to reach out much more to a broader public that needs to know why people need to read these works beyond what's just famous in their own country already. And I think it's been a challenge for me in an instruction, trying to write for a more general public. I remember and trying to think, what do we know about that the world needs to know? And this, I think, was a very important lesson I learned from Georg Brandes. He picked his battles. Ibsen and Kierkegaard, he promoted the hell out of them during his life with great success. He was a great gatekeeper. He got these people read in translation, far from their home countries. And I think we all have to do that ourselves. And this means not only translating and doing translation, but also translating a work, making it accessible, making people read it. When 9/11 happened, I got very depressed by the sort of stupid discourse of a clash of civilizations. I thought, well, what does the world really need to know about to understand if you go far enough back, this is one civilization? So I thought the world needs a book on the Epic of Gilgamesh. The general public needs a book. So I wrote a trade book, the first trade book on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I try to make it dramatic. I try to make it exciting. I started about the discovery of how it's important this was, that the book is dug up after 2,000 years. When I brought it in and I was talking about it with the publisher who's going to do it, he tapped the first page with his pencil and said, couldn't you just make this a bit more dramatic? And I thought it was. I thought I was telling you all about how important it was. But I was just telling you, right? I wasn't showing you, you know, like I hadn't read Henry James. Come on, people. Come on, Damrosch, you know? So I then rewrote it. I set the stage. The lights are fading at the British Museum. This working class guy cleaning tablets finds this tablet. He starts rushing around. You know, it became a whole different thing. And then more recently, there's this thing I was doing last summer that's now coming out in book form, Around the World in 80 Books. And I thought, well, you know, what do we need in a pandemic time? We need to sort of read, and we need world literature. And so I did the blog, which was a lot of fun in itself, in a different form of outreach, and got a kind of instant response that we don't normally have. And then for the print version, I sort of have an introduction talking about the pandemic. And then I come in and my editor to this book now says, well, this is fine, but you know, the pandemic we hope is going to go away, and we want to keep selling your book after that. Really, what else is it about? And that was really fascinating, right? And this is like my 9th book, for God's sake. You'd think I'd know what my books are about by the time I'm writing them. And of course, I think it's a real challenge for us. We know what we're writing about for people who already know what we're writing about. Do we know how to write for people who don't know what we're writing about? Why actually do we care? So here this editor, you know, makes me think, all right, actually what I really care about is ethno-nationalism. I actually care about, you know, what Trump was doing to the United States and is still doing. How do we get people out of this isolated shell long after the pandemic? It's been a problem long before the pandemic. So I rewrote the introduction to do that, which is again a question of the gatekeeper, right? The really good gatekeeper can be the publisher, can be the editor saying, what are you really saying here? And who are you going to write it for? So that's my main sort of moral of the story, is that we really need to figure out better how to circulate ourselves, our work, within our communities, beyond the small group who already know what we care about within scholarly communities more broadly, and then beyond that. So in conclusion, to answer my question, so what isn't world literature? So there never was a single literature anywhere that didn't develop in dialogue with other communities, other languages, and increasingly other regions, whether in emulation or in resistance. Now, you might make an exception for Sumerian literature and Old Kingdom Egypt, because no one else knew how to write at that time. And yet even the world's first known patron of literature, Shulgi of Ur here, who commissioned poems about himself and probably he claimed to have written them, and commissioned poems about Gilgamesh 4,000 years ago. He boasted of being fluent in 5 languages already. And he commissions poems in which, in this poem here, it's a prose translation, he already envisions his poetry will become known around the world. Now I swear by the sun god Utu on this very day, and my younger brothers shall be witness of it in foreign lands, where the sons of Sumer are not known, where people do not have the use of paved roads. That means anywhere else in the goddamn world, where they have no access to the written word, anywhere except Egypt, that I, the firstborn son and the fashioner of words, the composer of songs, the composer of words, and that they will recite my songs as heavenly writings, and they will bow down before my words. So the very first patron of world literature already envisions, before anyone else can read or write, that he will be the king of world literature, bowing down before his words. So my conclusion is this: if we read capaciously enough, with using the tools of translation studies, the tools developed at the interest, with enough critical engagement, with enough cultural and linguistic sensitivity, then nothing from Shulgi of Ur to Dante to Marisol Sekmur, nothing isn't world literature.
So the first question that we have is from Samina Halani, and she's asking, where do we place oral narratives or oral traditions within the realm of world literature?
Absolutely important. And it's also why I think it's interesting that Shulgi of Ur, you know, what he's talking about, he's absorbing oral traditions in 5 languages. So already, and for a very long time, written literature was secondary to oral transmission that continued, right, for a very long time. And you know, Dickens was writing to be read in family circles by the fireside. So I think, and I think these days in particular, it's great because we're living in a, to some sense, post-book age in which increasingly literature is reconnecting to the spoken word in all forms. This is also true for the need to strengthen the connection to film studies, where again, narrative has always been oral and visual, as it always was before in Schilke's time to ours. And so I think that orature, orality, and the interplay of the oral and literature and the literate is absolutely fundamental, which is why it's so interesting to now be looking at figures like Marisol Sakmur and others who come out of a predominantly oral culture, and their works are going to be transmitted orally also. So I think it's a really happening area more than ever.
And we just got another question in from Gerson Lima, who's asking, are there any texts you would recommend to study the internationalization of literature within the same language beyond Casanova or those mentioned by Casanova?
There's certainly been an increasing amount of interest within scholars of various, particularly global languages, of course. So you have Rebecca Walkowitz, for example, for English, Born Translated. She's talking about these kinds of issues. There's a whole series of studies in Anglophone and also Francophone studies. Also now there's the field of Sinophone studies, identified as Shumeishi and others, is really talking about that. But also I think particularly interesting these days to me is works, and you can find them in a number of countries, that will look at the interplay of the national and the international in a given setting. The sort of pressing against the often narrowing nationalism of a lot of literary historians in a given country. That somehow the writer is important because reacting only to other local writers or and translation and works from abroad are hardly even paid attention to. And this is sort of systematically read out of the history of literature. I don't know of a single anthology of British literature that includes any of Milton's Latin poetry, even though he was very proud of his Latin writing. The national poet of Slovenia, Franz Prešeren, wrote in German as well as in Slovene. You don't see his German poetry. The great ghazal poet Ghalib in North India was more proud of his Persian ghazals than his Urdu ghazals. You don't see them discussed in India.
I was nodding the whole time because this was a fantastic presentation. I just want to say that just like the last year, the 2020, when Comparing the Literatures came out, and that's written for a specific kind of audience, but also in a very accessible style. So I was also nodding, this is a very important point, that in order for us to keep reaching out to reading publics outside of the university, we also need to tune in to the kind of syntax and vocabulary that would appeal to them. And I think one of the things that around the world in AT Books, it's also a multimedial project, right? It started out as a series of blogs, reached out to the people, was shared on social media. So very much part of our reading habits today, and now it comes in the form of a book. So all I wanted to say is that kind of creation of readership that was so important to Brandes, that was so important to a number of publishers who sponsored translation projects. That's the kind of projects that I think we need. And by the way, anyone can talk to me about it. I have one point about translatability, but the one point that I was saying is, if you want to cultivate, especially among your undergrads, healthy social media habits, use Twitter to teach. It's great when they tweet about texts that they're reading, and that just creates a very different connection for them, especially when it comes to long form storytelling. So people tweeting about novels as they read them with all the emojis possible is a great experience. Translatability. I want to stress one more thing. I wonder if in Around the World in 80 days, 80 books, you're bringing up this point, David. General public often is so colonized with the idea that something is lost in translation. And I see that as everybody reads in translation, everybody loves to read in translation, but there is a strong emotion, and this is what I try to undo in my class as well, you know, with Larry Venuti's work, with the gains in translation, with the contra-instrumentalism, do's and don'ts. You know, don't treat translation as, you know, a secondary work or as an inferior work. So that takes a lot of time. I wonder if you're doing it. And I ask you also because untranslatability for me reeks of a caste system. It's very scary. It's, if you go back to that kind of Brahmanic hegemony that prevented, both in the colonial times, that hesitance to hand over the texts to the Brits, right? So there's Orientalism, but then there is also this kind of caste superiority that comes with the priestly class. And then all the way down to 3-4 years ago, when there was a move to remove, petition to remove Sheldon Pollock as the, you know, that was basically untranslatability, the authority of translatability being reduced to a small group of people.
And that's with him doing bilingual editions.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I'm wondering if there is, you know, while I've only read Around the World in 80 books in blog form, but if you're doing something in the book, holding people's hand and telling them there's no need to be afraid of translations.
Let me say, this is interesting also because I wasn't highlighting that in the book draft because I thought, oh, that's in game of academic. But then the other change that introduction from my editor saying, tell us about translation. How do we do it? Can we read about that? So actually that became up in the introduction, thanks to the outside reader, the non-academic, saying, we want to hear about that. How does this work? So I do in fact emphasize that. The other thing I want to say about that book that was quite liberating for me, writing in the blog, first of all, was the voice. Actually trying to write, having fun, and even kind of writing for a deadline, because every day I was writing another 1,500 words. You know, it was a challenge, but also it's kind of liberating to say, all right, say what I have to say. I only have this many hours in the day before I have to go on to the next book tomorrow. I only have 1,500 words, 1,600 words. Actually, I have to say what really matters to me about this book, which is, you know, challenge, but also turns out to be surprisingly doable, and then weaving connections across books. But the other thing that proved to work really well, I always feel that any form of scholarship is a form of sort of disguised autobiography. It should be we care passionately about something for some personal reasons. Otherwise, why spend your life working on it? And it's always a question of balance. I'm not so interested in, you know, the narcissistic self-display, but yet putting yourself out there in some way. This is why this matters. This is why I want to connect. And this is how maybe you can connect. So just started with the blog and it came into the book, and I think it really helped with the book. So like I have a section on Krakow. I go different places each week, or now each chapter. So with Poland, based in Krakow after Auschwitz, and talking about the legacy of the war. And there I talk about how when I first went to Poland, I was interested in retracing some family roots. My great-great-grandfather, Damrosch, had come from there, went off as a musician, that kind of road for upward mobility of assimilated Jews in that era. And I wanted to go and see his hometown. And going there to Posen, was then Poznan now, and thinking what it would be like if I'd grown up there, you know, eating, you know, sausages instead of Big Macs and reading Conrad and Polish translation and all of that. But then as I'm going to Krakow and giving a talk, we passed the sign for Auschwitz. And I realized, you know, if my great-grandfather never left, that's where we would have ended up. And I put that in the book. It's like, lead the reader in, ground yourself. This matters to people. We're all suffering this. And in a less directly personal way, when I come to talk about Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. I talk about how you can talk about it in colonial terms, you can talk about it in linguistic terms. You talk about it in intertextual terms. And you can approach it all these ways, but also I approached it because I was the son of a missionary, as he was. And my father wrote a little memoir late in his life about the Philippines in the 1930s. And it sounds in so many respects like the village in Things Fall Apart. And Achebe, was born 7 years before my father goes off to the Philippines. He's the son of a missionary. And so I talk about how that becomes my way in and thinking about those religious conflicts in terms also about the kind of idealism of the missionaries and the limitations of their life within the framework they're working in. So, and I think this really worked for the general audience. It's like, all right, here, this matters, and here's, you can come in. I think it's also kind of liberating for the audience, the reader, to think, all right, what's going to be my connection?
The next question we have is from Rajnandini, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Shah, who's asking, for whom are we discussing world literature and why? Does world literature have an afterlife in the languages that have dominated the reader's imagination in their originary language and translations in English at some point of their readership only?
Sometimes I've been actually criticized, saying, oh, it's the neoliberal market, it's just giving in to the hegemony of global English, blah, blah, blah. And I say it's a limitation of the What is World Literature book that I was primarily talking about how things get read as they come into English. So that was my starting point. And that's by no means the only way to do it. A polemic that I have in the more recent book is that scholars of world literature, comparative literature, are rarely reading scholarship in any other language than their own plus English, if they're not, if that's not their language, and maybe a little French and German. And I was saying that I talk about some Portuguese scholars, some Brazilian scholars, they might as well have been writing in Malayalam for all the attention they're getting outside. And that's Portuguese, for God's sake. And if you can read Spanish or French, reading scholarship in Portuguese is not very hard. So I do think that we need to be activists. And even as I have always claimed that things become world literature by circulation, also, like, I'm the first person to ever put Aztec poetry into an anthology of world literature. You want to push the market. You want to bring things in to whatever market you're in. I was particularly pleased with the Around the World in 80 Books blog that an editor in China, I was talking about, among other things, about Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad. That was one of my books. And it's in this series published by a small Scottish press, Canongate, on Myth Today. And a Chinese editor read that and was inspired and has now commissioned the entire Canongate series for Chinese translations. So I think when we're talking about world literature, the best thing is if we're getting works out into more languages and reading ourselves the criticism and the work from those countries, whether in translation or in the languages we can read.
This, I think, is related to a number of questions that have come up in the Q&A. So I'll just, lay it out. It's actually quite simple, although it requires a complicated answer. If all literature has been worlded in some way, always already, shouldn't we think of historical differences in the worlding? What is world literature in pre-modern eras isn't the same as world literature today among global relations shot through with consumer capitalism? No?
Absolutely. That's, as you say, a complicated answer. That's particularly why it's important that we have one colloquium that's dealing with pre-modern literature, and Steve Owen has taught for us before on the problem of the pre-modern. And I think that one of my polemics, as you know, and we share this with your magisterial Routledge reader, these issues go back millennia, and we need this depth. And even those of us who are working, when you're working in 20th century literature, 21st century literature, the people you're reading have grown up reading these earlier works, and it's part of a longer history. With all that difference, so that world literature certainly means something different to Ovid or to Apuleius, or to the biblical writers, or to Valmiki, than it means, or to Murasaki Shikibu, than it means to Goethe, and means something very different to Goethe than it means to us today, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, do you think in pre-modern eras, it might mean, being less in the world? I'm wondering if today, given, mass media, social media, the extent, the enormous extent of the internet, et cetera, not to mention capitalist economic relations, is it possible for any culture, any literature to somehow secede or preempt being worlded? I mean, as you've already suggested, I think, if a literature, if a writer says, I'm not going to participate in that global language that those fiction writers in the hypercanon are talking, I'm not going to do that. That refusal is still motivated by being part of world literature. So there's a sense today where there's no way out, possibly.
That's what I do sort
yeah.
of, when I conclude that nothing isn't world literature anymore, it's not simply a good thing. It's a complicated thing that I think any writer, well, it's an interesting question. Not that every writer has to deal with it, but that the text will enter into world relations whether or not the writer even thinks about it. And this is true. It struck me with Higuchi Uchiyo, most important woman writer of the Meiji era, 1890s. She sees herself in relation to Ihara Saikaku and Murasaki, Shikibu, and the contemporary Japanese writers of her time. She didn't read any other language. She never studied another language. She wasn't paying attention. But in a glowing review by Mora Ogai, her older compatriot, who sort of puts her on the map, he says, at last we have these really good characters, not like these bestial characters that we get in Ibsen. He's already reading her vis-a-vis world literature. It can't not happen. But that's, and that's, unfortunately, it happened too late for Ichiu because she died of tuberculosis in her mid-20s before she could reap the benefits of it. But yeah, I think it's really interesting that not necessarily every writer has to think about it, but any publisher is thinking about it now. Any translator has to think about it now. Any reader should be thinking about it.
Cesar was asking, how do we write about interesting writers that get ignored because of their politics or their choice against secularism? Is there a way to bypass an already politically charged discourse?
I really think it's the same strategy with Brandes, but also with Hugo Meltzel, who I'm interested in, who did the first journal of comparative world literature in the 1870s, a Transylvanian scholar. And he grows up in a German minority there, learns Romanian and Hungarian in school, but is very much a promoter of Hungarian culture. And he puts his money on one guy, Sándor Petőfi, and he gets Petőfi's work translated to 32 languages in his journal. He's gonna push hard. I think we have to ask first, who is the writer who has been neglected, for whom there are reasons why the people neglecting him or her should read them. So my view is not so much to say, oh, you bad post-colonialists who won't read my favorite author, what's wrong with you? It's like, look how much better your argument about imagined communities would be if you could imagine a community that imagined itself as religious. How Ben Anderson's book would be better if he took this in. And I hope that Ben Anderson, no longer alive, his students, let's say Feng Chia's students, might now say, oh, look, I could read something. And this struck me very much when I was doing the long anthology of world literature. My wonderful, distinguished colleague Sabri Hafez, who was editing the Arabic material. It was an article of faith for Sabri that there was no important 20th century writer in Arabic who was religious. It was an article of faith. Well, it turns out there actually could be, and the anthology would be better if it showed, and would actually respond, of course, better to what's happening in the world. If you understand that religion isn't something that just disappeared with the Enlightenment, which is what Benedict Anderson says in Imagined Communities, almost so many words. So I do think not so much being in the face of the people who are neglecting, but actually saying, of the many writers who aren't being discussed, and most writers not being discussed, who do I care about passionately, for whom I have a reason why this is the time where the audience needs it, which is why for me, Gilgamesh at a certain time, 10 years before, there wouldn't have been a market, I wouldn't have had a way to do it. Right now with the blog, people are really interested in, they wanted me to have less European stuff, more non-European. For the general reader, they want to hear about it. So I think it's the moment where these things can come in, but always you have to know, pick the battles. You might know 100 authors, you might say, now here's the one that I can press today.
And we've also got a question in the chat from Hoda, who's asking, with globalization, is the task of comparing literatures getting easier or more difficult, especially with the opening of the world because of technological advances? Is there an equal or actually increased tendency to assert difference from the rest of the world?
You know, I think it's the best of times and the worst of times, to take a literary phrase. I think it is opening out in a way that's really exciting. So Penguin Classics, for example, which used to be so Eurocentric, then they gradually move it. But now they have like, Penguin is now publishing 4 works by this Malayalam writer, Parama Morogan. 4 of them, contemporary Malayalam writer. This is fantastic. And so that makes tremendous opportunities. At the same time, and in my little graph that I showed with MLA citations, we're not doing nearly as well as we should, because there are still these hyper-canonical writers. There may now be Salman Rushdie, J.M. Coetzee, almost always guys, almost always people writing one of the hegemonic languages, still get 90% of the attention within our scholarly communities. And so I think we need to do a much better job of writing that balance. I think that the major power is being replaced by the celebrity author, and that's not a good thing. And we have to fight against that culture of celebrity that just causes someone to be the flavor of the month or the decade, to the neglect of so many others.
The next question that we have is from Lara El Makawi, who's asking, when we speak of what is not world literature and opening up the categorization of world lit to include everything, is this about moving beyond canonization or expanding the criteria for canonization?
That's a really nice question. I still think that most works in reality are not world literature, in the sense that most works do not actually get widely read beyond their immediate community. Now that's still the case. I've somewhat modulated my own emphasis on circulation, because I think it's still possible to say world literature equally can be works that circulate into the wider world, or works that reflect the world coming into them in a very distinctive way. And a lot of works do that. So so you have some works are born as world literature, some works are achieve it, some works have it thrust upon them, as Malvolio might say. So like Higuchi Chiyo was not writing world literature, nor was Dante. It becomes world literature afterwards, and that can still be the case. It's still the case that at any given time, most writers are not being read, and you know, the canon still hasn't opened up very much. I do think it's a somewhat counter-canonical move to emphasize works that matter to us, but any one of us is creating a micro-canon. As John Guillory emphasizes in the book Cultural Capital, the real context for works in a class is the syllabus. The syllabus for this moment is the canon that you are presenting. It's it. And you can say to the student, oh, this writer is particularly canonical outside or not, or you can call it a great books course or not, but it's the momentary canon you're creating. And I think it puts a burden on us, and the difficulty is deciding for ourselves why it matters, and both to engage with current concerns, the current discourse, but also not to be trapped by it. So the market is not only the neoliberal global market of global English or something like that, but it's also the market of our academic community, our university. One of my polemics is also that too often teachers don't look at what's being taught around them. And at least in the United States, you may come out reading Nadine Gordimer, or you may read Salman Rushdie in 6 courses and never read R.K. Narayan, never read Khalid. And no one is saying, well, you've already got Rushdie in 5 courses, why not Narayan in course number 6?
The next question we have is from Yasser Ahmad, who's asking, do you think that Emily Apter's concept of untranslatability is politically tinctured, or what is the politics motivating that sort of statement?
Well, the short answer to that is, well, duh. Venuti has a really eloquent discussion about this which is now in his book Contra-Instrumentalism. I recommend it very highly, and it is that kind of, I mean, elite you know, how much untranslatability can you afford? I mean, it's such interesting, you know, she's an old friend, but it's such a complicated work because it's so up to date, but it's also kind of a rearguard holding action in favor of the comparative literature for youth of the 1970s, where it was English, French, and German. And when you look at the works, the words that are totally translatable in her book, they are phrases in French and German. You know, Kant, Hegel, and Derrida are inherently translatable, apparently. She just gives a word for a translation, whereas Arabic is not. You know, how can this be? So yes, there's a certain politics. And there's an academic politics, which is very insidious for all of us in academia. It's hard to see, right? The wider politics are very progressive, and yet there's a retrogressive academic politics that I think we all have to watch out for.
Another question we have is from Simla, I think Doğan is how you would say that. I'm sorry, I think that's Turkish, and my knowledge of Turkish pronunciation is terrible. Who's asking, thank you for this wonderful introduction on the role of translation in promoting world lit studies. I was wondering what you think about writers such as Canonization Murad, the author of Regards from the Dead Princess and the Story of Begum, whose work, although translated into English from French, gets eclipsed by her imperial pedigree, although she has received a number of prestigious literary prizes.
So I don't know the writer, so I don't have a direct opinion. But the more general question is if the writer's politics is overshadowing other aspects of the work, how do we deal with that? Would that be the generalized question?
That's how I understand it, that it's somebody who comes from an imperial or colonizer background. But Simla, if you want to add to that, go ahead and throw something else in the chat, and that might help too.
But to start with that, we did at the last Idawela conversation Delia and I had with Orhan Pamuk, and he has expressed some frustration about this. He says, you know, he's pleased now that in Turkey, and it's not just abroad, that in Turkey finally he's writing some novels that are getting widely read. He said, finally I'm Turkish, not just because I get taken to court for my political views, but because I'm now writing about subjects that are viewed as Turkish and not overly international. So it can be overshadowed at home or abroad, and in a certain sense, it can be liberating for an author to be read outside their immediate political context, where they may get a limited reading. Alternatively, on the other hand, we all have to watch out for the reduction to the flavor of the month, and not just a given author. Philip Roth edited a great series of translations of Eastern European works called Voices from the Other Europe in the 70s, most of which are now out of print because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the American public lost interest in Eastern Europe as a whole, you know, because the political searchlight had turned someplace else. This is not helpful for the entire body of literature, let alone for the individual writers. And I also think, so I mean, to me, I do have a certain, still, as perhaps my own upbringing and orientation, a belief that as important as the politics of writers are, what really, if we really want a political disquisition, we go to a different kind of writing than fiction or poetry. We're entering a world through a language, and we always want to think about that. And I think that either the overemphasis or the underemphasis on certain themes or politics or identity politics is teased out more through the language and through close attention to how they're saying what they're actually saying.
We have another question from Mustafa Karach, which looks like it came in really early, actually. I'm interpreting a little bit here, but he's asking whether the statement, nothing is not world literature, in what sense is that similar to the statement, nothing is untranslatable?
You know, I think I go back with Emily Apter to her previous book, The Translation Zone, which starts out with some theses on translation, and the thesis, the two ends are nothing is translatable, everything is translatable. And I think on some level that is really true. And we're always balancing that dichotomy. One of the people I talked about in my blog and now in the book is Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian American writer, and she's complained in interviews, like she's always treated as writing about Nigerian politics. She says, sometimes I'm just writing a bloody romance. She wants to be allowed to do that. Pamuk complained some years ago that he said that any time, you know, Proust writes about love. They say he's writing about love. When I write about love, they're going to say I'm writing about Istanbul again. And I think, we don't want people to be trapped by their own identities, even as, and I think this is true, both Adichie and Pamuk are in fact known for writing about their countries. It really matters, or about the connection between their countries and abroad. Of course, that's a central theme, but it shouldn't be treated in a reductive way also.
The next question we have is from Rui Yun Liao, who's asking, who says, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation on world literature. I wonder, do you believe, and to what extent, that comedy is translatable or untranslatable? Comedy and humor.
That's a really interesting question. And it's important because, as Kafka says, there's no defense against a joke. A joke well told has a political point. And I do think, well, comedy is often site-specific, and again, not all comedy will really work abroad. My brother Leo has often taught a course on comedy, and said it's really interesting that how comedy will often age very rapidly. 20 years later, something was absolutely hilarious just isn't anymore, and it's really a rare comic work, that, even within their own culture, that will outlast its own generation. And yet, certain kinds of comedy, Voltaire or Molière turn out to play very well even today. Molière in New York is done for free in the Prospect Park in Brooklyn and gets large crowds in good modern translations, of course. It holds, even if a lot of his jokes don't work. So that's a good example. Some comedy just will never be world literature in the sense of being funny outside the immediate circumstance, but then it can be. Particularly since a lot of comedy does deal with universal issues, body image and parents and social concerns, and it's as universal as tragedy, after all.
All right, and one very last question that's in the Q&A. Vince Jin is asking, is world literature just world literature of some popular languages?
So my polemic is that it shouldn't just be. And it shouldn't just be some popular, at the moment popular, cool, neglected languages. Or I mean, it's good that, let's say, Arabic is now, Arabic works, or Turkish, partly thanks to Pamuk, is getting widely translated. That's good, but that Thai literature is not so good. But also that Norwegian. Remember Theo Dan remarking one of our institutes some years ago with some asperity that it used to be that Dutch literature was neglected in comparative literature because it wasn't a major power. Now it's neglected because it isn't from the global south. So that, Dutch is as important. And I now teach Multatuli, who I didn't used to teach before. So yeah, I think it shouldn't just be the flavor of the month of the language or the hegemonic languages. And at the same time, the hegemonic languages aren't just hegemonic. Not only are they multiple, and Paul Giles had just written a great essay for a new edition forthcoming in Routledge Companion to World Literature that I've edited with Theo Dan and Jalal Qadir, talking about global Englishes as so counter-hegemonic in many respects and hegemonic in others. I mean, he's a very politically savvy guy, but now writing from Australia. And I recall also, increasingly I'm interested in the way to say English, and this will be true of Spanish, French as well, Chinese, becomes a transit language. So for Pamuk's work, which has been translated about 60 languages, half his translations are done from English. And he knows that. And he would rather be translated well from English than poorly, directly from Turkish to Vietnamese, or not translated at all. And he works very carefully over his English translations, knowing that that's a relay language. So here's a case in which the global language has enabled communities that would never have been in touch otherwise to be able to be in touch in their languages.
Actually, more questions have appeared, so I'm sorry that I misled everybody and said that was the last question. There's one that looks like I had missed before from Alessandro Raveggi, who asks, in comparing the literatures, David, you refer to the topic of multilingualism, for example, books by Christine Brooke-Rose and its value for a new idea of comparative literature. I'm working currently on the same topic with references both to translation studies and the concept of world literature. And I would like to ask, what's your opinion on the relationship between multilingual literature and world literature?
Well, there's a great, I just in the mail this week got this book from Bloomsbury Academic called Multilingual Literature as World Literature. Oh, the prophetic post office. This is this great series, Literatures as World Literature, that Tom Beebe edits, that's published by Bloomsbury Academic, in which Delia's second book appeared in that series. And they're making a strong point, and this is Jane Huddleston and Wenjin Ouyang, who've edited it. She's at Oxford and he's at SOAS, for the importance of multilingual literature, and that it's a whole new kind of emphasis than the traditional emphasis also in translation studies, was you have one language going into another. Here are these multilingual texts, and they're contributors of examples from all over the place. I mean, from everywhere, Morocco and you know, new all over. So I think, and I think as Larry will affirm, that there's a lot of interest now in complex and multilingual texts. And indeed, the text about the Quiche writer that I mentioned, the essay that's now in the Journal of World Literature by this Figlerowicz, talks about how it is even multilingual, because she's writing in a world of Spanish hegemony, and Spanish forms and tropes come into the Quiche. So there's almost, you could almost say there's almost no longer any monolingual literature, just as there's everything is world literature, everything is in some degree multilingual, which is all Bakhtin was already pointing out within Russian discourse, but now it's true of the internationalization of the world in so many languages.
Thanks, David. So the next question that we have is from Samina Halani, who's asking, how has the value of literature or world literature evolved over time?
That's interesting. You know, I think it is. I think it is moving away from being an elite enterprise. For Goethe, it was an elite thing of himself and his friends, basically. And I think comparative literature and world literature studies, often in the 20th century, was still elite literature and a probably elite audience in many parts of the world. And was also still often quite nationalistic. Often in many parts of the world, you were showing the importance of your literature by showing it deserved a place as world literature, or it's absorbed the greatness of other great texts as world literature as such. And I think that what's interesting to me about the study of world literature the last 20 years is not so much top down from an elite, either authorship, readership, or also academic elites, where it's a few Ivy League schools showing, you know, that have sophisticated a lot of language study and going down, trickling down maybe to colleges. But at least in the US, the emphasis on world literature starting 25 years ago was initially from elementary schools and high schools. There were big immigrant populations coming to the United States, and a lot of interest in thinking about the world. This begins to percolate up first to like community colleges and undergraduate colleges, and only then the Ivy League was the last to learn. And I think there's a profoundly anti-elite or counter-elite quality in a lot of world literary studies, that popular literature and the literatures of non-elite languages and cultures, so to say, are now very much in the mix. So in my 80 books, I have like a bunch of works of crime fiction, you know, Dror Mishani from Israel, Donna Leon, the American writer set in Italy, Conan Doyle, you know, would not have been seen in world literature terms before, but now is possible to have. And I have a little polemic in the Comparative Literatures book about the Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, the most widely read book of the 20th century, never discussed in world literature or in comparative literature circles. High time it should be.
Next question we have is from Gerson Lima, who's asking, considering that no genre is more or less national or nationalistic by itself, why do you think that most world literature and world literature studies deals with novels instead of, for example, novellas or short stories?
Well, thank you for that question. And a further polemic I would have, I didn't quite make into this talk, is that why prose fiction? What about poetry? What about drama? What about film? What about popular music? I think, you know, we literary scholars are somewhat of modern literature, are somewhat in a position of of classicists who are a century and a quarter, a century and a half ago, who are clinging to the classics, not noticing all this other literature around them. And I think that, why so much the novel? Why so much shorts? And even short stories are much more found than poetry in most circles. But I absolutely feel that the novel, and I think it's a form, again, of institutional Eurocentrism that people don't even realize, who are very politically progressive, and yet they're just talking about novels, which is the most European form they could possibly talk about. Why not talk about poetry? Why not talk about popular song? Why not talk about movies on equal plane with the novels that we like to read? So yeah, I try to push back, and I think we should push back about that, which again, probably doesn't mean only teaching poetry courses, but interfering our courses with poets as well as novelists. Just as strategically, we may interfuse our courses with less known writers along with some big ticket writers that students will know they want to read. I think it's a very good strategic plan. And I think world literature studies would be completely changed if it was based in poetry rather than in the novel. And better yet, if it would have a base would take account of both.
And that's a good segue because the next question is about poetry. So Andy Eaton is asking, thinking about contemporary American poetry, are there poets or poems that you see embracing or resisting an idea of being part of world literature?
I think one thing that's interesting in terms of American poetry, which has often been rather inbred, is that it is in a much more of an international world these days. And it's partly just because of the movement of bodies, of poets, of people. Derek Walcott, who was for many years commuting back and forth between Trinidad or St. Lucia and Boston. And his world is, friends like Seamus Heaney. In my book or the blog, I have James Merrill, an American writer as you could have, but I pick his work, Prose of Departure, which is a kind of a renga kind of thing. It's a kind of it's a basho-based poetic diary with haiku about a trip to Japan. So I think there's a huge internationalism, which again, it's probably the scholars, the Americanists are the last to realize. The poets themselves are much more likely to be aware of the world they're living in and who they're rubbing up against all the time, and who else their publisher is publishing, and what languages they're being translated into. I think it's become a very international sphere.
Next question we have is from Tehazar Lere, who's asking, thank you for such a wonderful introductory discussion. I'm curious about your views on scientific texts as part of world literature. I mean scientific texts both in the narrow sense as it relates to scientists like Newton's Principia, and to the broader sense as it relates to ancient medical and astronomical texts containing ideas that moved around the ancient world between different languages and cultures.
So this is interesting that Georg Brandes, in that essay I mentioned, he starts out by saying, what is world literature? Well, for example, scientific literature is obviously world literature because it circulates worldwide. So he is already thinking of that. In the ancient world, it's so interesting, and this is something I've argued about quite a bit. I just finished working on a big anthology with a bunch of Swedish colleagues, primarily literary world history. And they did not want to have a history of world literature. They didn't like the concept particularly. They wanted to think more regional worlds than a world, in 4 volumes coming out. And one of my co-editors is saying, well, literature doesn't exist before it's invented in the 18th century. So well, what about all these texts before that? What does that mean? They're not literature? So if you go back into antiquity, I don't think, so you don't have the modern concept of literature per se, and it was a much broader sphere. It could be humane letters, it could be anything written, but I also think that there's some value in narrowing it down. I think what we now call literature often was thought of under terms of poetry. A dichter could be a writer of almost any sort. And say the Egyptians had a term medet nefret, and that meant beautiful words. And this would encompass certain subgenres like of song, but also rhetoric, speeches. So I think they felt artful language was the base of anything distinct from other kinds of discourse. And that would certainly include religious texts. I mean, the Bible, the Quran, I include those in my book, absolutely. And scientific texts, I think it's perfectly okay to say that it's distinct if it's using language artfully, and there are scientific texts, Darwin, for example, that do that. Otherwise, let it be a different kind of thing.
And I see right now one more question in the Q&A, and so maybe we should answer this question and then call time there.
Good.
Chutong Wong is asking, thank you for your great talk. I wonder whether you think there are some forms of literature that may be more translatable or more untranslatable. For instance, do you think that poetry might be more untranslatable than novels?
Well, this is an old debate, as Larry knows a lot about this. The dogma used to be you couldn't translate poetry. And so the early anthologies of world literature had almost no lyric poetry. You might have narrative poetry. And indeed, the Penguin Classics, when they first translated Homer, it was prose translations. You wouldn't even try to do it as poetry. I think that's wrong. There are works that are so tied to the local, there's not even so much language, I don't think, as reference. So that, let's say, the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson, great historical Norwegian work, Scandinavian, Icelandic work on the kings of Norway is unknown outside of Scandinavia, not much read there. Whereas the Poetic Edda is widely read, very complicated, intricate verse. You can't translate it directly in any real sense, and yet it's translatable. I think Dele has described to me a masterpiece of Mircea Cătărescu called The Levant or Orbitor. Which is it called?
The Levant.
Sounds like completely
yes, it's the Levant, yes. And actually it was translated into French, and I hear also soon it's going to be into English, but it changed completely, as in lost the whole political context. And right now it reads like some sort of adventure novel with pirates and everything, you know, so completely, you know, decontextualized and recontextualized to be something else.
And even though from a description, this epic is engaged with every phase of the history of Romanian poetry, and that you just, you know, it's going to become something completely different. On the other hand, I was given recently a fantastic Chinese translation of Finnegan's Wake, heavily annotated, which apparently sold out 10,000 copies, you know, within weeks. So it can be done.